Hey, Mark, how are you?
Very good, very good. How are you? Let me start our introductions. I'm Mark Schmitt. I'm a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. This is maybe the 6th or 7th or maybe even the 8th of the Blogging Heads episodes that we've kind of organized through the auspices of Roosevelt under the title Fireside Chats. And
How appropriate.
And I'm glad you're able to be here with us. Why don't you introduce yourself rather than my doing it for you?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson.
Well, actually, we didn't say your full name.
My name is Tevi Troy. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute here in Washington. We're over on 15th Street. My first job in Washington was actually with Mark Schmitt at the American Enterprise Institute.
Right.
You're going out of the closet on this one.
I know. Not a lot of people know that about me. That my first job was I was a research assistant for Norman Ornstein, the congressional scholar and noted moderate in all ways at AEI.
Except in his dress.
What's that?
Except in his dressing patterns.
Fair enough. And you were working at that time. This is almost 20 years ago, maybe more than 20
more than 20 years ago. Yes.
You were working for Ben Wattenberg, I think, at the time.
Yes, that's right. Ronald Reagan's favorite Democrat.
Right, exactly. And it was, I have to say, it'll be interesting. We're going to talk a little bit about think tanks in this conversation. It was definitely an interesting community, especially of younger people, and with a significantly wide range of ideological orientation among people there.
And some who went on to make some real noise in the policy community, who are pretty well known over the years.
Fair enough.
Remember, Dinesh D'Souza was there with us, and Jonah Goldberg was there.
I don't remember. I think I remember Jonah Goldberg. I don't remember Jonah Goldberg.
I think he was just a little after where you left, but I was there. I overlapped with him.
I do remember a one long conversation with Dinesh D'Souza about his book on political correctness on campus. So there it is. People who are used to that may be surprised by that. And you have the distinction of being somebody I've known. You probably have more pictures of yourself with George W. Bush on your wall than anybody else I know. That's a significant distinction. You worked in the Bush White House and in the Labor Department during the Bush administration.
I did both those things, but I was also the Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services during that administration as well.
Okay, so that's a lot of domestic policy work during that period. What I'm most interested in talking about today, Tevi, is the article that you published in the magazine National Affairs a couple months ago about what you saw as a kind of increasing politicization of think tanks and a tendency to be less the dispassionate experts and a little more engaged in the political process. And I think you saw a certain amount of downside to that. And I wonder if you can you can sort of talk a little bit about that argument, and then I think we both have a lot of thoughts on it, particularly some of the ways it's become increasingly relevant in the light of the argument about the future of the Cato Institute, which is a fascinating, I think maybe a bit of a special case, but a fascinating example of an argument about what a think tank should be.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I write this out of love. I mean, I'm a fan of think tanks, as we were just discussing. My first job in Washington was at a think tank, American Enterprise Institute. I've also had fellowships at Heritage, at the Claremont Institute, with the Institute for Humane Studies. So I've had a lot of affiliations with different think tanks over the years, and I think they do a lot of good work.
Right, and I've worked at I've been at New America Foundation. When I was at the American Prospect, we were partners with Demos and now Roosevelt. So I've covered almost as many think tanks as you have.
We've run the gamut, and they do good work. They're also a mixed bag. There are some that are better than others, and some are more political than others. But what I noticed, and what led me to write my article in National Affairs, was a pattern that was emerging. That think tanks, if you look back over the history of think tanks, had started to emerge in response to electoral losses by people on their ideological side of the aisle. What do I mean? In 1984, the Democratic Leadership Coalition, which is not the think tank itself, was founded in response to the Democrats' losses in 1980 and 1984. They quickly realized that they needed a think tank, and they developed their own think tank called the Progressive Policy Institute, which helped develop a lot of Clinton's ideas in his 2 terms in office. But just as that think tank led to Democratic successes, Republicans lost an election, specifically the 1992 election, and a bunch of Republicans went out to form their own think tanks after the 92 election. And so you had the Project for the Republican Future, which Bill Kristol founded, and then you had that all-star team of Jack Kemp, Gene Kirkpatrick, and Bill Bennett, who went and founded Empower America after the Clinton victory over Bush in 92. And then after the 2000 election, there was a lot of Democratic talent kind of left out on the table with Bush in the White House, and Democrats went and created their own think tank called the Center for American Progress, which is explicitly modeled on the Heritage Foundation and takes a very political view of things. In fact, one of their vice presidents had said, others should strive to be objective, we do not. So they're pretty open about what they're trying to do, and it seemed to me that there was this pattern emerging, and then after 2008, there were a couple of Republican organizations that have formed think tanks as well, including E21 and American Action Forum. It's hard to say what the nature of those are going to be because it's still too early, but these are emerging think tanks. And whoever wins and whoever loses the election in 2012, I think you'll see reactions. And I called this pattern that was emerging, lose an election, gain a think tank, kind of modeled after this notion that the Carter foreign policy, some neoconservative foreign policy wags used to say, was lose a country, gain an ethnic restaurant, because you had ethnic restaurants emerging in great numbers in the late 1970s in Washington, Iranian restaurants, and Vietnamese restaurants, etc. So it was an old joke, and it sort of popped into my head and inspired me to write the article. I ended up not using that title for the article. It was called Devaluing the Think Tank, but I did use that concept and explain that concept in the article. So it just seems to me that think tanks have become more political over time, and each iteration of think tank that becomes more and more political, I have found, tends to be further and further from the original model. So it's like carbon copies getting fainter and fainter, and the original model is that of a university without students, where you can have public policy experts and scholars weigh in on great issues of the day, come up with public policy solutions, but not necessarily be beholden to a teaching schedule in the university case, or not necessarily be beholden to a political party in the political establishment case.
Right. Which is a very technocratic model, along the lines of the Rand Corporation or the Urban Institute, let's say.
Or Brookings, more. I mean, which was really the original, the granddaddy of them all, as they say.
Right.
Rand had more of a sort of contract research aspect to it. That I wouldn't say they paid for their research, but they would get these major government contracts, or sometimes corporate contracts, to do huge amounts of research. That is a little different from the Brookings model, which is just we will opine and weigh in on the great issues.
Right. And I think Urban Institute began with actually a federal charter. I think they're in a sense a great society creation.
Yep.
If I remember correctly. It's an interesting. I think there are a lot of dimensions to the theory. I mean, there's always a tendency of there's always a place for administrations in exile, right? I mean, a lot of people at Brookings would always be the foreign policy establishment that doesn't happen to be in power at the moment, for example, or the economic advisors who don't happen to be in power at the moment. I guess one aspect of I think there are a number of questions that your piece raised, and I think to some extent, I mean, generally, I think you're right. I think the causes of it are part of it may be the simple polarization of American politics as an underlying feature of it, but and it's not all new. I mean, the founding of the Heritage Foundation, as I recall from reading histories of the right, is a number of people, I guess it's Weyrich and others saying, we need something that's in the game in a way that can't, and it's not AEI because AEI is just not in the game in the way that we need to be. That's the late 70s, right?
Yeah, in fact, there is an origin story of the Heritage Foundation, which I described in my piece, which is there was a vote on this issue of the supersonic transport, and the forces in favor of it lost a close vote in the Senate. And days after this loss, these staffers that you mentioned, Paul Weyrich, but also Ed Fulner, who became the president of Heritage, they got this report from AEI explaining why it would have been a good thing. And they called up someone at AEI and they said, well, why are you sending us this piece now? It would have been helpful a couple of days ago. And they said to Fulner and Weyrich, well, we didn't want to affect the vote. And so Fuller and Wired said, well, that should be the exact point of this kind of institution. And they came up with this idea of heritage. And heritage specifically writes its papers so that congressmen or senators can read them in the time that they go from either the Rayburn building on the House side or the Hart building on the Senate side to the floor to vote. You can read and digest that opening page, the summary page, if you will, and you'll know how to vote in the heritage perspective if you read and digest that.
Right, right. And actually, it's interesting. When I went to work on the Hill, my boss at the time, the legislative director for Senator Bradley, said to me, you're going to get you're going to get 3 of these things from Heritage a day. Don't just toss them out. Make sure you look at them, because that's the counter arguments you're going to be facing.
Yeah.
Or not always, because there were certainly occasions where we might be on the same side. But more often it would be the counter argument. And I remember, I followed that advice faithfully, and all these things on the cover say, nothing in this document is intended to influence the outcome of legislation.
Of course not.
But of course, that's precisely what it's intended to do. And, a policy think tank that isn't engaged with the actual outcomes of policy is a kind of, I think there's a place for it. There's certainly a place for the, the very, the 5-year longitude, the 30-year longitudinal study of outcomes of participants in a particular work training program, that sort of thing. But ultimately, something that's translating that. I think there's a lot of layers, I guess, of translation from what we know to public policy, but then there also is plenty of things that I think, they may look like things. I wasn't sure that I never thought of Empower America as particularly a think tank. It's kind of an advocacy institution with, with an agenda as well as a place for people who aren't in power at the time.
Well, that's a good point. There are different types of organizations, and you and I have talked about this, but there's the so-called advocacy think tank, there's the university without students model, there's the construct research model. So not all think tanks are alike, nor should they be alike. There are about, 1,800 think tanks and 400 in the Washington area in the U.S. right now. So there's a lot of think tanks. A lot of them do very different things. Sometimes you'll find one from, pick a senator from a state who's retiring, the Bob Dole Institute at University of Kansas or something like that. So a lot of them are homes for old or retired legislators. But what I was trying to talk about in my piece was really the ones that are in the center of the action, really in the thick of the fight, the ones that are the best known. And on the right, it's Heritage, Hudson, where I work, AEI, Hoover, Manhattan, Cato, and then on the left you've got obviously Brookings, CAP, I'll have to include Roosevelt Institute, of course, Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. There's a number of them that are really in the mix, and I try to look at that 30, 40, 50 think tanks rather than looking at all 1,800, because it defies categorization to look at such a big number.
Right. It's funny. It's a kind of institution that it's sort of bizarre that it even exists, and that you and I both managed to be employed by them, and and largely is very limited in other countries.
Yeah, absolutely. They've exploded in the U.S., and to the extent that they are emerging in other countries, it's been a relatively late development.
Right. There's 4 or 5 kind of interesting ones in the UK. Maybe there are others that I'm not as familiar with. And generally, I find that when you talk to people from other, fully industrialized countries, they're not aware of similar institutions. But at the same time, a lot of them, if you talk to somebody from Germany, they'll say, well, our parties have all that built into it.
Yeah, of course.
It's part of the party apparatus.
There's a structural reason for this. So in a parliamentary system, you have a party, and the party determines what the policies of that party are, and everyone has to vote along with what the party apparatus says.
Right.
And you have, I know people complain about polarization and how the most conservative Democrat is now more liberal than the most liberal Republican, but you are not necessarily married or wedded to your party in the U.S. In fact, the presidential election campaigns are a great opportunity for developing the policy platforms of the various parties. It's not done internally by the party apparatus. It's done externally by these people who are vying to be the voice of the respective parties. Right.
And I almost think, I have this pet theory that, in a sense, what you see in a presidential campaign, you take something like 2008 with the 5 or 6 Democratic candidates, regardless of their viability, they were all putting out a lot of stuff, and to some extent, and really in this Republican campaign as well, you almost see a test of, the idea machine. What's it got? What's it put together? What does it have out there? I mean, I think people often think of the Obama healthcare plan as being purely a creation of Obama, but it's actually something that over the course of months and years before, long before Obama even became a candidate for president, there was a lot of meeting and thinking. My colleague Glenn Nichols at New America Foundation was part of it. There was an enormous amount that went into actually putting together the policy that could work, and then putting together some of the alliances. It was essentially a prepackaged deal. I don't think he had a lot of options about what the what an alternative might be.
Right, and there are other famous policies throughout history that have think tank origins. You think of the Marshall Plan, really grew out of the Brookings Institute, and deregulation in the 1970s came from AI, and welfare reform was a bit of a Hudson Institute initiative. And then again in the 2000s, the whole idea for the surge in Iraq came out of AI. So you do have think tanks that really can help shape policy at the governmental level.
Right. Now, sometimes that's just by in a sense, being sort of a home for a certain kind of policy entrepreneur or publicist. It's not necessarily like the institution is doing this great work. There's just somebody who's in a position to write those op-eds and keep banging on this idea. I mean, it's not like welfare reform needed to be necessarily invented.
Right, and in fact, the best think tanks in my mind are not think tanks that have one policy position that is the position of that think tank. Right. So at Hudson, where I work, for example, you've got people who have different perspectives on a whole bunch of issues. AI also, I mean, you can have people who strongly disagree about, let's say, the healthcare reform. Norm Ornstein, for example, was extremely helpful to the Democrats in the way he sort of blessed every parliamentary maneuver that the Democrats used in passing the bill. While at the same time, you had people at AI who were very critical of the healthcare bill and railing on it in multiple forms. So I think good think tank can have people on different sides of an issue.
Right, and that's actually something that time I spent at AEI when a long time ago was really valuable in conversations I've been in about the kind of more liberal think tanks you want to have. There tends to be a belief that everything on the right operates in very, very much in lockstep, and in fact, there's a lot of internal disagreement, and that's largely productive for the most part. And then an institution like, one of the things that's emerged, and I think you had a panel discussion about your paper at the Hudson Institute, and I think it was Will Marshall from BPI, who I thought did a very good presentation, talked about kind of the emergence of either the explicitly bipartisan think tank, like the Bipartisan Policy Center, which I think has actually done a lot more great work than I had originally expected. I remember actually making a little bit of fun of it when it first started out, or something like New America, where there's a lot of essentially the kind of focus on fresh or new ideas creates a kind of quirky, some unpredictability and a fair amount of internal disagreement. So that's in a sense, there are some things that have emerged recently that are almost contrary to your thesis.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a little skeptical, or a little more skeptical than you are, of Bipartisan Policy Center in New America. I think they are generally liberal organizations that give a nod towards bipartisanship. So I'm not sure that works, but I do like the fact that you have...
Bipartisan Policy Center is... I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. Go ahead.
I think it's a good thing that you're trying to have institutions that are saying we don't want to be bound by partisan or ideological predispositions. But I think the way these organizations have emerged, I think that they are more organizations of the left than they are of the center or of the new idea world. And it sounds like you disagree, though.
I think I disagree. I mean, I think there are two very different types of things. Bipartisan Policy Center sort of explicit. I mean, I remember it began with Daschle and Dole and George Mitchell and Howard Baker, I guess.
Right.
The most established, retired party leaders possible. So it's in a sense it's bipartisan, but it's kind of bound by existing partisan agreement. And I remember making, at the time they said, the thing that's going to be fresh about this is that people like us never talk to each other. And it's like, actually, three of you are partners in the same lobbying firm, so you probably do talk to each other. And so it's a product of, what I expected was something that would be very limited within an existing Washington consensus. And in fact, I think they've been pretty creative in a couple areas, I think, in getting out a little further than what the existing scope of consensus. And I mean, New America, I think, it's a little bit, it's very much a home for entrepreneurial ideas. Their idea is a little different because it's external, and it's not about, it's not kind of organized by and for people who've already attained a certain level of power. So it's, the attraction is to ideas that are coming from a little bit outside the existing political space. So I think those operate a little differently. But I think it's fundamentally a liberal progressive institution. Although I definitely have liberal progressive friends who wish it were more.
Sure.
And I think that's overlooking a really core strength of an organization.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are people who would like to see, say, Hudson be more conservative, or but the idea of these think tanks is not that they are beholden to a party, even though you might have individual people at the places that are of a partisan nature. I mean, I'm a Republican. I've worked in a Republican administration. I advise a Republican campaign. I mean, I make no bones about it. But Hudson doesn't hire people based on their partisan affiliations. And if whoever I were to endorse in the 2012 election, it wouldn't matter. So if I were to endorse Obama or Romney, it would not have an impact on my standing or status at Hudson. I can see there are other think tanks where it would be pretty uncomfortable. So, for example, if you were at CAP and endorsed Romney, or conversely, if you were at Heritage and endorsed Obama, I don't think that would be very good for your career prospects at that place.
Right, but the thing is, I mean, there's often a tendency, I think, to mix up partisan and ideology. And the more, there was an era when those things very much crossed, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, PPI was essentially a Democratic think tank, but it could work and it was explicitly a Democratic think tank. And it was born out of an organization that was kind of trying to the Democratic Leadership Council that was trying to. Their theory of the world was we have to save the Democratic Party by moving it to the right. So as a result, it was a Democratic think tank that could work very closely with a lot of conservative organizations and think tanks, and that was, I mean, I'm not actually a DLC hater. I think they did some really good work.
And remember what the left would say about them: the Democrats for the leisure class.
Right. I think ultimately their political theory was actually wrong. You were not going to keep a Southern white male base of the Democratic Party, no matter what your welfare reform proposals looked like, or whatever. But there was actually a fair amount of creativity. In a sense, I think PPI has more to show for it than DLC. DLC was the positioning that allowed PPI to work in this interesting zone where there was some good stuff and some not so good stuff. But it was easier to be idiosyncratic in an era like that, so it was partisan, but its ideology was complicated. And then you might have another. I mean, Hudson is it's not a place where there's a lot of room for liberals, but at the same time you're saying. The importance of the Republican Party thing isn't that important, and they're definitely there are conservatives. I mean, there are people like Doug Kimmick. There are basically conservatives who endorsed Obama in 2008, and I think there are places that would be a better or worse, and most of them have since changed their mind. But there are places where that would be career suicide. Obviously, I think in Heritage, and places where it wouldn't be. But that's their ideology and partisanship aren't the same.
Yeah, I had a friend who was at Heritage in the 2000 election, and he was a McCain backer, and he said it was pretty uncomfortable even to do that. So.
Right. I mean, that's the other thing. A lot of them are sort of trying to do a faction within a party.
Right.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I want to talk for a second about Cato because it's an interesting case because libertarianism obviously, cuts at an angle. No matter, you may think there's an argument about is its natural home more on the left or the right, and probably the answer is more on the right on the whole. But there's no question, especially if you take the totality of Cato's work on civil liberties and drug policy reform and things like that, that it's not, there's a huge difference between being a Republican Party think tank and being a libertarian think tank. Whereas there's not much of a difference between being a very conservative think tank like Heritage and being a Republican Party think tank. And so the issues that have been raised by the battle for control of Cato between Charles Coke and, or is it David or Charles who's suing?
I thought it was both of them, right? They're brothers.
Both of them together, Charles and David Coke, and Ed Crane, the president of Cato, who's trying to maintain control of the institution. The issues there are pretty sharp. It seemed to be, and I think we're some of this is a little bit of, you may know this better than I do, but from what I've read of the reporting, seems to be based on a question of do the Cokes want Cato to be more like the other things they fund that are really political arms of the Republican Party, or keep the purely libertarian perspective. You've written a little bit about that, but what's interesting to me about the reason I think that's interesting to raise is it's that choice is very, very stark when ideology and partisanship are really cut across each other. I think there are cases where it's a little different because ideology and partisanship match up.
Yeah, I think the Cato thing is a little not clearly stated in the media, and I'm not sure we know everything that's going on there. And there are a whole bunch of reasons why there are disagreements at the top there. And I think that this notion that the Cokes are trying to make Cato an arm of the RNC is a myth that was easily fostered based on some of the New Yorker pieces about the Cokes. It was easy to kind of marginalize the Cokes based on that. So I think there's more going on in the story. But regardless, I think the fight over Cato and this whole argument about whether Cato is supposed to be helpful to the Republican Party or whether it's supposed to be this independent think tank that is libertarian, so it's with the Republicans on some issues and with the Democrats on other issues. I think this fight is damaging to the reputation of think tanks and this notion that think tanks can be independent of party and can just be working to get the best policy ideas out there. Now, they might be promoting an ideological worldview, as Cato does, but they're not necessarily beholden to a party, and they don't say, well, let's promote this policy because it'll help the Republicans. They say, let's promote this policy because we think this policy, A, will work, and B, it fits in with our larger worldview.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you see that sharp. I mean, like, exactly what it would look like if Cato were trimming its sails on, on civil liberties issues or things like that.
Or foreign policy.
On what?
Or on foreign policy, for example.
Or on foreign policy, because those things are very different. In the case of, say, Center for American Progress, you don't, there's no, essentially, yes, they come from they come from a basically progressive worldview. What they are putting forward, what they think are the policies that are right for the country, and those are not going to be radically different from what President Obama and the majority of Democratic senators think are good policies for the country. But that doesn't, in a sense, that doesn't necessarily mean that one is doing this bad thing and one isn't.
No, I don't think I'm saying that at all. But I think if all think tanks were to have this partisan approach and they were all just offshoots of either the RNC on the Republican side or the DNC on the Democratic side, I don't think there would be much value in think tanks. And people, whether in the media or in politics or government, wouldn't look to think tanks for ideas or solutions if they just thought it was an offshoot of the party apparatus, like we were talking about before with the foreign countries, how the party apparatus helps develop the policies. Here, we've got these separate independent institutions, and the parties can pick from among them. But I don't think that the think tanks themselves should be offshoots of those party organizations. And I just don't think it's helpful, and I don't think it comes up with interesting policy, and I don't think it comes up with policy that can have develop the bipartisan support we need to solve some of the bigger issues we have, like, for example, the debt crisis. Right.
But in a sense, it's, there's an overall discrediting of expertise all around. And I would argue that a lot of that has been driven by the right. I mean, one comment about I sent around your article to a bunch of my colleagues, and one comment I got back was, well, one thing that's actually led to this is, when the Republicans came in 1994 and they defunded the Office of Technology Assessment and they stripped out a lot of the expertise that was there in some of the caucuses and things like that, and in a sense tried to discredit some of the independent institution. I mean, like Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, for example, has always been roundly trusted. There's a pushback that they're treated as more ideological. So the kind of discrediting of expertise makes it sort of hard to maneuver without being a little bit political, you know?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, this goes back a long way in the 1930s when President Roosevelt had his brains trust. They were derided as pointy-headed nincompoops who couldn't be elected dog catcher, and Adlai Stevenson had his intellectuals who were called eggheads, which was initially a term of derision. It probably still is, but at the time, Stevenson did adopt the term.
Right.
What was that famous line? Eggheads of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your yolks.
Right. There's also the famous line of, Mr. Stevenson, all thinking people will vote for you, and he's like, well, I need a majority.
Yeah, that's true. But then remember, I mean, this goes back a long way. Remember William F. Buckley's line about how he'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than the entire Harvard faculty.
Right.
So, I mean, there is a distrust of experts.
I have a theory about that. By the way, which is I think that was at the time George Bundy was the dean of the Harvard faculty, and George Bundy had written this vicious review of Buckley's God, Man at Yale. So I've always thought that was just when he said rather be ruled by the people in the phone book than the Harvard faculty. That was a very specific dig at it was just an Ivy League in joke. I thought.
Nevertheless, it has a lot more. It has a lot more lasting effect, and is remembered much longer than even George Bundy, who was a pretty senior official in the Kennedy administration. Right,
and later president of the Ford Foundation. Mitt Romney said, has this little crusade against Harvard of his own, which is at least William F. Buckley went to Yale. Harvard. One of the issues that's interesting to me that I think you didn't really say as much about in the piece, and I'd like to get your thoughts on, is kind of what the sources of funding for think tanks, what effect they have on the way think tanks work. I mean, I always think about it, for example, on the right. I think AEI, for example, was primarily funded by corporations and to some extent by foundations. Heritage comes along; it's largely funded by both super rich individuals and actually, I mean, it's probably the only think tank in the world that has a significant small donor base. Well, those people are looking, tend to be more likely to be looking for red meat than corporations who tend to be looking for, things that are helpful to their interests, but not necessarily inflammatory things. And then you have other think tanks that are funded. Most of the ones that I know are funded largely by foundations, which don't tend to be, can't be very partisan, and tend to, they tend to lock a think tank into thinking about specific programs and policy ideas, as opposed to, let's say, a heritage donor, or maybe some cap donors were just kind of like, I want to do something for the cause of conservatism or liberalism writ large. What do you think the role of funders is?
And remember, there are think tanks that are funded by labor unions as well, and that colors their perspective.
That is another model of funding. The Economic Policy Institute, if they were represented here, would protest that they're not that funded by labor unions. And it doesn't. I mean, that is their worldview. It doesn't color their worldview. That is their worldview. But we'll accept. Yeah, there are a whole range of donors. There are also, as we said, think tanks that have state and local government contracts that do very technocratic work as well. So there's more funders than just the.
I think whatever organization you have, somebody can always criticize that organization by saying, oh, look, here's this funder, and that means that everything they say is colored by the fact that they have this one funder, whether that funder gives $2,000, $200,000, $2 million. But what I think is really important is to limit the funding from any one organization so that it is not the overwhelming driving force behind the organization. Krista Muth said at that panel that you and I were at, Mark, about my article, that AEI had a rule that no more than 2% of its overall revenue should come from any one source, so that they could absorb the loss of any one funder if the funder didn't like it, and that they could also say, look, we're not beholden to this person, they only have 2% from that person. But I don't think that anyone really thinks that AI would change its conservative worldview if a more liberal corporation started giving them money, or for a more liberal foundation. I mean, their worldview is their worldview, it's their brand name, as it were. But at the same time, our think tank scholars above looking at who the funders are and saying, well, maybe I don't want to take a direct shot at this funder. And, I'm sure people have that in mind when they're writing stuff. I mean, if let's say you're being funded by, I don't know, you mentioned labor unions, the SEIU, you're not going to have a scholar take a direct shot at the SEIU because, it's kind of, muddying your own waters, I guess. So, So I think it's an issue, but I don't think it's the issue.
I think I'm actually more thinking. Obviously, every institution has things like that, and you have I'm not thinking quite as much about the sort of quid pro quo around a single funder, but I'm thinking about the difference in kind of tone and the way you're thinking about the world based on different types of funders. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
having individual funders means you essentially have funders who are they're typically Republican funders. They're typically people who are also political funders. If you have corporate or foundation funders, they're typically not.
Right. I've heard complaints about think tanks that say that their funders want scalps on the ground or whatever, so that they actually have political goals that they want the think tank to achieve, and I don't think think tanks should be doing that. I think think tanks should be developing good and interesting new policies. But there is definitely a sense that funders want something for their money, and what can they show for their money?
Right. So what are to your mind, outside of the Hudson Institute, what do you think are some great think tanks that embody the kind of independence and putting out new ideas that you think it's
Well, Brookings, as I said earlier, it's mostly a liberal organization, but it's got some smart conservatives over there, and it really does not seem to be beholden to funders. Maybe I'm not inside the board meeting, so I can't say for sure. But when something comes out from Brookings, people say, "Oh, that's a well-respected study." Hoover, I think, is a pretty well-respected think tank on the right, and I think they've got such a big endowment that they're not actually worried about day-to-day fundraising so much. So that is helpful it's liberating for a think tank. AI, where you and I guess, cut our eye teeth, was always a place that was very well regarded and had brought a lot of smart people together. So there's some places that do good work. The Century Foundation in New York is more on the left, but has some smart, interesting thinkers who go out of the box. So they're think tanks.
They have a great new president, and really are stepping up their presence in a really exciting way.
Yeah, I like Janice as well. I think she does good stuff. So I think there are and can be think tanks that do good work. I just worry about this whole trend and this movement towards think tanks that must be political organizations or that must advance a political goal. I don't think that's helpful.
Right. I guess I just differ a little bit in that I think, I do think, for example, that CAP does terrific work, and I think they do their work with an independent mind, and it is a reality that the way they're approaching the world tends to be roughly correlates with where the majority of Democrats are. I think it's an interesting coincidence. In a sense, CAP has the think tank side, and then it has the things that they often do through the CAP Action Fund, which are almost more like some of the rapid response to in the debate, Think Progress and things like that. That maybe feel a little different, but they're very different. In a sense, those are very different sides of one institution.
Yeah, but I think CAP was groundbreaking in creating this the C3, C4. I guess we talked about DLC, PPI doing it, but CAP did it on a much grander scale. And Heritage even followed them in later years. Heritage has its own C4 now too. And when I say C4, I mean it's an organization that is not donations to it are not tax deductible, so it can engage in political activity. But not have political activity as its primary purpose. That's right. But it can engage in political activity. I think I'll stand by that definition. So CAP...
It can also engage in more lobbying than the C3 alone can, although the C3 alone can do some lobbying.
Right. But look, if a study comes out from CAP, it is seen as a study that is trying to advance the interests of the Democratic Party. Now, maybe you and your attendant might say, well, that's not the case, that we're actually independent, blah, blah. But the fact is, it definitely has that perception. And your reputation is so much in this game. And so, I've talked to people in the Obama administration who say, well, if a study comes out from CAP, we're not necessarily going to tout it to advance our policies because it doesn't really prove anything to people who might be skeptical of us. Similarly, in the Bush administration, if there's a study out from Heritage, we wouldn't go ringing the bells and saying, hey, here's a heritage study, this proves our point, and then the Washington Post and New York Times are going to drop their opposition and say, hey, the Bush administration is right, heritage said so. But there are places that are better regarded from an independence perspective, and that those studies, I think, can get more traction.
Well, but then the question becomes how exactly, like, what should Heritage do to fix that problem?
I don't know if Heritage wants to fix that problem. I mean,
right.
we
but
have
let's
that
say
panel.
you did. I mean, let's say. I mean, I think the stuff that comes out of CAP. Frankly, I think in its first couple of years, I think that was a reasonable critique of things that came out of CAP. Which is to say, when I would look at them, I would say, I remember they did a tax plan 5 or 6 years ago that I thought was really much too narrow. And I thought, a progressive think tank ought to be coming out and saying, we really need revenues at the level of, 19 or 20% of GDP. But I thought they were, in a sense, trimming their sails to fit within the cautiousness of the Democratic mainstream. I'd like to see them out there setting almost unreachable, solid research behind it to show, but setting more of a standard, which is a little bit more the kind of work that really I think where they are now, which is a kind, that's certainly a kind of independence if you're avoiding the cautiousness of the political process. But there's nothing. I mean, if you say nobody's going to pay attention to a CAP study, then nothing that it doesn't matter whether they put out good studies or not, right? They might as well put out crap.
Well, first of all, I didn't say nobody will pay attention to a CAP study. I said that they have a higher bar. It's harder for them to be touted by people on the left as proof of their argument because it just doesn't mean that much because of the I guess the original sin, the partisan nature in which they were found, and similarly on heritage. Okay, if organizations can turn around, they can change their reputations over time. Unfortunately, it's easier to sully your reputation for a reputation to go down than for a reputation to go up. But there are ways to do it to kind of become more measured. Let's say CAP hired some conservatives or Republicans or is willing to criticize Democrats more. I mean, I don't think that's their mission statement, but there are things they can do to make themselves seem a less partisan organization. Again, I don't know if they want to do that, but there are ways to do it, but it does take time, and it's not something easily done or lightly done.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I just don't, we live in a world where Republicans are conservatives and liberals are Democrats. So if you're a generally liberal think tank, there's no reason to hire Republicans. I mean, there was a day when you would hire, there are those people you would hire, I say Mickey Edwards, which is not quite fair because Mickey Edwards is actually quite conservative, but he's super smart and well-meaning. I mean, there are a lot of Ron Haskins, for example, who's a fairly moderate Republican, who actually works he's at Brookings. But there's not a new generation of folks like that. So simply hiring some Republicans to give yourself bipartisan credibility and then you're putting out the same work doesn't seem to me to be adding a lot of value. I mean, I think the work ought to ultimately speak for itself.
I agree with that. I think the work does speak for itself, but as I said, it takes time, and you would need to do certain symbolic steps along the way in addition to producing a different type of work. And you'd have to have someone outside independently say, hey, you know what, CAP is doing different kind of work these days, or Heritage is doing different kind of work these days. Again, I don't think it happens easily, and you build a name brand, right? Heritage has built its name brand, and I think been successful in the fundraising wars, to be sure, at developing what it is. And so I don't know why it would go and change what it is. I mean, you seem to be indicating that CAP wants to be seen as a more serious, less partisan organization.
No, I'm not saying that. I don't speak for CAP, but I'm actually just challenging that I don't think there's any reason that they should be seen as a serious policy organization because I think they do super serious policy work. Now, if it's like, let's say something comes out, like for example, 2 weeks ago that the study by Charles Playhouse about Medicare, the Medicare Trust Fund.
Well, that got a ton of play.
It got a ton of play, part because he had the credibility of being a Social Security trustee, and although it was coming out of the Mercatus Center, it was interesting. There was, you could say, this isn't credible because he was a Bush administration official and so forth. Or you could also say it isn't credible because of the following problems with the policy analysis, which is, what Bob Reichauer, the other Social Security trustee, and others said. I think most things it's possible to judge them. Some things are so arcane that only a few experts really can really dig into a report. But most things you can actually judge the substance on its own, and I don't think there's anything out of CAP that I'm not saying there is something out of Heritage. Frankly, I no longer get those reports every day.
You don't have to.
Right. I just don't think there's anything out of CAP that merits that kind of treatment, that kind of dismissal. You know who they are. It's straightforward who they are.
Yeah, I intentionally in my piece did not go after specific studies and judge them on their merits as if there was some kind of Empyrean scale that you could say, oh, this study is worthy and this is not. But what I did try and do was get a sense of the reputations of various think tanks, and I think I accurately captured CAP's reputation as a place that really focuses on communications and outreach, that does have a very strong ties to the Democratic Party and specifically to the Obama administration. I had that joke in there by Tim Carney that when Van Jones left the White House to go to CAP, it was counted as a transfer rather than a shift from organization to organization. So they have developed a reputation, and look, they've done a very good job. They said they wanted to bring about a Democratic administration. There was a Democratic administration. They said they wanted to be competing with Heritage. They're competing with Heritage. They've built this large institution. They are a home to Democratic thinkers in and outside of administrations, and when Democrats are in power and when they are not. So I think on their own terms they have succeeded, but they also did it in the guise of being this partisan organization, and I think they embrace that reputation. I also think you can look at what think tanks choose to focus on. So CAP was quite critical, and I'm citing a New Republic analysis on this point, but CAP was quite critical of the war in Afghanistan when Bush was in power. And then when Obama came in, and he largely followed the same policies, they suddenly stopped talking about the war in Afghanistan. So, the absence of comment on things also is indicative of an approach.
Yeah, I actually vehemently disagree with that, and I could point you to an article that we ran in the American Prospect about Afghanistan, which had some extensive quotes from Brian, whose last name I can't remember, at CAP about that was quite critical of the administration's Afghanistan policy. So I don't want to get in a fight over examples, but I think that's actually a really good example of CAP being quite independent. But
I'll send you the New Republic article. Let the Prospect and the New Republic fight it out.
We'll put the two links up with this discussion. There's also another function. This is something. Your piece quoted a fair amount from Andy Rich's book about think tanks, and what's interesting is that Andy was the president of the Roosevelt Institute from 2009 until last winter, so it's got a little connection here. Part of Andy's argument, of course, is that not only parties but activists of all kinds, need ideas and need to understand that they're part of a debate about ideas rather than just a raw debate about political power. So even if a think tank is helping, a party or in the case of say PPI, a segment within a party, or maybe one that's more focused on the further left wing of the Democratic Party. If they're making that segment, better grounded in the reality of how the economy works and better able to think about ideas about how to solve a problem, or developing something like a healthcare plan, even if they don't have credibility with the Robert Samuelson at the Post, or the arbiters of elite Washington opinion, they're still making the world smarter. This would be
I'm not sure I know about the smarter part, but look, I don't have
more grounded in ideas, more creative, more able to think up fresh approaches.
Yeah, as I think I'm trying to make clear, I'm not opposed to think tanks. I think think tanks are a good thing, and I don't have a problem that we have more think tanks. But one thing I worry about is this notion of devaluation of the think tank. And I got some of these ideas from Andy's book about if you have think tanks that are seen as partisan organizations, does it devalue the research and the work of organizations that are more independently minded and that are more research focused? And I think that is a real concern, and I think it is something that could potentially happen, and in some ways is starting to happen. And I think that, as I was saying, with the Cato fight is kind of fostering this impression that think tanks are increasingly partisan and can harm the overall reputation of think tanks.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think to me it's drawing out a pretty interesting argument about that's actually illustrating that a think tank can be quite independent. I mean, I think a lot of people would tend to dismiss Cato, and being reminded, there's an interesting conversation there was an article in The Nation 2 days ago by Mark Ames that was basically arguing, Cato's they've always been an arm of the Republican Party. There's nothing new. This sort of liberal sentimentality about the good old days of Cato is just wacky. But I think actually, all the conversation about that article has been super critical. Everything that I've seen, and I think that the criticism is really well taken. So we're in a sense learning a lesson about that there is an independent stance, and then something like what's nice about kind of Roosevelt Institute, for example, is we really, most of my colleagues are in New York. We're pretty detached from the administration. We have a sort of, keep this kind of Rooseveltian concept in mind, which means you're not thinking about the current president. You're thinking about a set of ideals that exist apart from the, the current political process. I think, it's a real illustration that one can be independent even if one has a strong viewpoint.
Yeah, on that Nation article that you sent me that I read before doing this interview, in a strange way, I actually agreed with him. Not that I agreed with his analysis that Cato is not independent, because I do think that they have struck an independent chord over the years in terms of their willingness to criticize both parties for deviation from libertarian ideals. But the thing I agreed with him about was this notion that all of a sudden the left is uniting behind Cato and saying, "Oh, what a wonderful institution," and thinking about the halcyon days of how we love Cato. It just seemed a little absurd to me that many on the left, like Ezra Klein, were taking this approach. I certainly never heard about this before the Kochs and Ed Crane got into a fight.
Right. Well, I had, and I don't love Cato. I don't celebrate Cato. But I do think that an independent Cato, which is able to be an ally on civil liberties issues and drug policy reform issues and criminal justice reform issues, which I had a lot of colleagues. I worked for Open Society Institute who were interested in that. Having that independent ally is super important. Is extremely valuable. And that doesn't mean you have to love everything. I mean, you should have more think tanks that you love half the things they do and not the other half of the things they do. That should, in a sense, be the marker of an independent think tank.
Yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that many on the left valued Cato as an ally, but you just weren't reading these paeans to Cato and how wonderful it was until this fight struck up. But on that point about disagreeing, on that point about disagreeing, one of my favorite politicians is Ed Koch, who used to say that if you agree with me on 8 out of 12 issues, you should vote for me. But if you agree with me on 12 out of 12 issues, you should see a psychiatrist.
I think that's right. I think that's a good marker for the relationship that any of us, either as individual writers, whatever, not writers with opinions, as well as think tanks. That's kind of the relationship we ought to have to the political process.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you know, Mark, you and I are of different political parties and ideologies, but we agree on all sorts of things. Okay. I'm not going to say them. I'm not going to say them out loud here because it could get either of us in trouble. But,
okay.
But we have over the years agreed on things. So.
I think we have over the years probably agreed on things. Maybe some of those years where we were actually out of touch and we were simultaneously agreeing at a distance. No, I mean, look. I mean, the other side of partisanship is that it really does tend to exaggerate the scope of different. I mean, there are different worldviews out there, but in many areas they are not as irreconcilable as the kind of the way some of the language treating things as if they're two totally different worldviews, kind of often portrays things as far more pulled apart. There's broader consensus, really, in the world than sometimes the political process suggests. And so the interesting question is whether something like that, I mean, very often a lot of what think tanks do is convening and drawing people together. Can they, can ideas sometimes reduce the level of pulling apart and help find some of those real consensuses? And we haven't had much of success on that front in the last few years, but I think that's a role for those institutions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd like to see more of it.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have we're at 55 minutes here. I wanted to talk about things like Americans elect, but maybe I'll save that for some other gullible partner.
All right. Sounds good. And we'll start another time.
Okay, well, this is a great cover. I mean, I think I picked some points of disagreement, but or where I wanted to pick further at your argument. But I really do want to say that I thought, the reason I wanted to do this today was because I thought it was a super important and an excellent article, and something that raised an issue that everybody in this kind of policy, the worlds that we're in, ought to be much more open to talking about and thinking about. And I think you really got a really important conversation going.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate you doing this interview.
Sure. Okay, we will.